Every year, trillions of dollars worth of good pass through a body of water that most people rarely think about. Yet, this sea has become one of most dangerous flashpoints on Earth. It is home to vital shipping lanes, rich fishing grounds, and potentially enormous oil and natural gas reserves. And today, several countries are competing for control over it. Warships patrol its waters, military bases have been built on artificial land, and a single incident could potentially draw in the world's two greatest powers, the United States and China. But why is the South China Sea so important? Why are countries willing to risk conflicts over tiny islands and reefs? And why could the future balance of power in Asia depend on who controls this sea? This is the story of why the South China Sea matters to the world. The South China Sea stretches from the Taiwan Strait in the north of waters near Singapore and Indonesia in the south. It is surrounded by several countries including China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan. Scattered throughout the sea are hundreds of islands, reefs, and shoals. Among the most important are the Spratly Island, the Parcel Island, Scarborough Island. Many of these features are tiny and uninhabited, yet they have become the center of one of the world's most complicated territorial dispute. The South China Sea is one of the busiest maritime highways on Earth. Nearly one-third of global shipping passes through these waters. Goods traveling between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia depend on this route. Oil from the Persian Gulf reaches countries such as China, Japan, South Korea. Through the South China Sea, everything from electronics and automobiles to food and raw materials travels along this corridor. In this route were disrupted, the consequences would be felt across the world. Supply chains would suffer, energy prices could rise sharply, and economies everywhere would feel the impact. This is why many experts consider the South China Sea one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. Beneath the waters of the South China Sea lies potentially vast reserves of oil and natural gas. Although estimates vary, these resources could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. For countries that rely heavily on imported energy, these reserves are extremely valuable. China, which imports massive quantities of oil every day, views access to these resources as crucial for its long-term energy security. Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines also seek to exploit these resources. As a result, competition over energy has intensified the territorial dispute. The South China Sea is one of the world's richest fishing grounds. Millions of people depend on these waters for their livelihood. Countries throughout Southeast Asia rely heavily on fishing for food and employment. However, overfishing and environmental degradation have caused fish stocks to decline. As resources become scarcer, competition between fishing vessels have become increasingly intense. This has often led to confrontation involving coast guards and naval vessels. Even relatively small incidents have the potential to escalate into diplomatic crisis. China claims nearly 90% of the South China Sea through what is known as 9-Lane. Beijing argues that it has historical rights over much of the region. However, these claims overlap with the exclusive economic zones of several neighboring countries. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all reject China's position. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China's historical claim had no legal basis under international law. But China rejected the ruling and continues to maintain its claims. As a result, tensions in the region remain high. Over the last decade, China has transformed reefs and rocks into artificial lands. Many of these islands now contain airstrips, radar facilities, missile systems, military installation. China argues that these structures are necessary for defensive purposes. However, neighboring countries and the United States view them as efforts to strengthen Chinese control over the region. This militarization has increased concern throughout the Indo-Pacific. Many fear that the South China Sea could become the site of the future conflict. Although the United States is not a claimant in the South China Sea dispute, it has major interest in the region. America believes that no single country should be allowed to dominate one of the world's most important waterways. The United States supports the principle of freedom to navigation, which allows ships and aircraft from all countries to move freely through international waters. This is especially important because nearly one-third of global trade passes through these waters. To demonstrate this commitment, the US Navy regularly conducts freedoms of navigation operations near disputed islands. Washington also maintains strong allies throughout the Indo-Pacific. This includes the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Australia. In particular, the Philippines and the United States are bound by a mutual defense treaty. American leaders fear that if China were to gain complete control over the South China Sea, Beijing's influence across Asia would grow dramatically. As a result, the region has become one of the most important arenas of competition between the United States and China. And because both are superpowers, even a small incident could escalate into a much larger crisis. For China, the South China Sea is about much more than oil or islands. It is also about national security. Chinese leaders fear that rival naval forces could block access to vital trade routes during a crisis. Since much of China's oil and trade pass through these waters, securing the region is considered a strategic necessity. Control over the South China Sea would also help China project military power deeper into the Pacific Ocean. From Beijing's perspective, dominance over these waters is essential to protecting China's rise as a global power. The South China Sea is closely connected to another major flashpoint, Taiwan. China considers Taiwan part of its territory. The United States, meanwhile, supports Taiwan's ability to defend itself. Any conflict involving Taiwan could quickly spread into the South China Sea. American allies such as Japan and the Philippines might also become involved. This means that a regional dispute could potentially evolve into a confrontation between major powers. Many experts believe the South China Sea is one of the places where a future great power conflict is most likely to occur. The South China Sea is not just an Asian issue, it affects the entire world. Global trade depends on these waters. Energy supplies flow through them. Millions of jobs are connected to the commerce that passes across the region. If war were to break out, shipping routes could be disrupted, oil prices could rise, supply chain could collapse, and economies around the world would feel the consequences. What happens in the South China Sea does not stay in the South China Sea. It impacts, reaches every corner of the globe. So why is the South China Sea so important? Because it sits at the crossroads of trade, energy, food security, military strategy, and the growing rivalry between the United States and China. For China, it represents security and national power. For neighboring countries, it represents sovereignty and resources. For the United States, it represents freedom of navigating to the balance of power in Asia. And for the rest of the world, it represents one of most important arteries of the global economy. Because in the 21st century, control of the seas may once again determine who shapes the future of the world.